Welcome, everyone. Good afternoon. Thank you for joining us at another event at the Remarque Institute. My name, for those of you who don't know me, is Stefanos Geroulanos. I'm the director, where I work with Sam Paul and Amy Nguyen and Lauren Lee. I am delighted to have a chance to host our three speakers, but I'm going to say a little bit more to begin with about let's say, the backstory, the idea behind the event for today. So little by little at Remarque, we've been trying to establish a more regular and careful public discussion or set of public discussions of one of the key aspects of modern political life and one of the less studied, namely the intersection of aesthetics and politics. This is a fundamentally interdisciplinary inquiry, and all too often different fields accuse each other of only engaging with elements of it. So art historians see historians as just vaguely using images in an illustrative sense. Historians accuse art historians of looking too closely and missing the forest, proverbial forest. Few political scientists, and they mostly in political theory, are even equipped to work with images in context and to try and do very close work through them. I think you get the idea. The convergence of aesthetics and politics, often in very different styles, is key to the current political disposition that we find ourselves in, both in specific countries and more broadly. And it is just as key to thinking or to understanding, let's say, the question, what is it that makes us think as we do? So over a course of many events in the past few months and ongoing from here on, like political emotions on the far right, an event from right after the last election, through last week's event on Europe and the Wolf and the book Europe and the Wolf, we've been trying to circle the subject of how to think about aesthetics and politics sort of long term. No less important for Remarque is that we think of Europe not in the very geographically bound and sense that, let's say, a certain kind of union would like us to think of it in, but far more broadly, and considering with it not only the ruins that it's often left behind, but also the ongoing dimensions of its engagement with the rest of the world. So with this, we thought of having an event around the visual politics the visual politics of post-colonial Algeria in and beyond. So we have three speakers with us today. Beya Othmani is an Algerian Tunisian art curator and researcher, and the Contemporary and Modern Art Perspectives, or CMAP Fellow for Africa at MoMA. Prior to coming to New York, she was a fellow at the American Center for Maghrebi Studies in Tunis. And in 2023-2024, she curated a three-part exhibition, Cantando Bajito at the Ford Foundation Gallery, Aracanes at Rhizome Gallery, and the Ljubljana 35th Graphic Arts Biennial. Now a CMAP Fellow, she conducts her own research, but she also plans programs and co-edits post.moma.org. And with us, she is here to revisit her project, Algiers Insolite, or the Insolent Algiers, so it doesn't translate very nicely as that. An online screening and discussion series that was part of a research project for the 2021 Rencontre photographique d'Arles. The program aimed to explore the place of the colonial space of Algiers Center in post-independence artistic imaginary. Now, she will go first, and then after her, Robert Desjarlais is a professor of anthropology at Sarah Lawrence College and the author of many books that span from healing in the Himalayas to homelessness in Boston to chess, and now to two books on France. The first being Traces of Violence, co-authored with Khalil Habri. How are you? Very well. Change your hair a minute ago. Which concerns the aftermath of the 2015 terrorist attacks in Paris, most famously the Bataclan. Now, I first read Bob's sensory biographies, Lives and Deaths Among Nepal's Yolmo Buddhists, thanks to a mutual and inspiring friend, Todd Myers. I've been hoping for an occasion to bring him and his patient and meditative, philosophical, yet very grounded way of thinking to Remarque. In this book, The Visual Afterlife of Abdelkadar Bennahar, he begins with an image taken by the photographer Elie Kagan of an injured man, and he built out of it a A careful, historiographically researched, and ethnographically inflected meditation on life, death, on the aftermath of an encounter, on the circulation of Kagan's images, and so on. And last but not least is my dear friend Judith Surkis, who is a current fellow at the Remarque Institute this semester, and who will speak to us about the concluding parts of the book that she is preparing, The Intimate Life of International Law, Children and Development After Decolonization. Judith is a professor of history at Rutgers University and the author of Sex, Law, and Sovereignty in French Algeria, 1830 to 1930, and Sexing the Citizen, Masculinity and Morality in France, 1780 to 1920. She's also the author of a series of essays on historical method that I consider particularly astute and to which I return time and time again. I've been asking her to do this. At any rate, so the idea that she will speak of her project and the artist Katia Kameli, Katia Kameli's work with photographs from which the image and the poster was also derived is a real pleasure for me. So at this point, I'm going to stop. Please join me in welcoming our three speakers for today.
Thank you, Stefanos and Samantha, for the invitation to speak. Disclaimer, I'm going to start by speaking about a film. We may not have time to watch an excerpt of the film, but the film is available online for free on YouTube, so you can watch it anytime if you're interested. So my presentation today is titled The Battles of Algiers, the City as Post-Colonial Allegory. In 1976, the Algerian filmmaker Merzaq Alwesh released his first feature film, Omar Getlato. Omar follows a young man in Algiers whose ordinary life, spent between music, friends, and neighborhood routines, is shaken when he becomes infatuated with a woman's voice. The film opens with a striking image. You can see that's the first image in the film, a close-up of the main character foot. Right from this first shot, we're introduced to Omar in a surprisingly intimate way through something as ordinary, even embarrassing as a hole in his sock. This moment sets the tone, signaling that the film is going to be deeply personal, centered on everyday life rather than on heroic or nationalist themes. Then the camera zooms out and Omar introduces himself. He talks a bit about masculinity, but then quickly shifts to speaking about his neighborhood. We learned that Omar lives in a neighborhood in the district of Bab El Oued. The neighborhood is Cité Climat de France, which is a housing project built in the 1950s by French architect Fernand Pouillon. And so when Omar speaks about his block, Alwesh, Merzaq Alwesh, the director, plays between close-ups and long shots of the buildings. It feels as though the camera set out to wander the neighborhood only to be called back by the pull of the close-up. The rhythm shifts when Omar starts recounting his experience of the War of Independence and the Battle of Algiers. Just to give a bit of context, the Battle of Algiers was a guerrilla war that took place in the capital between 1956 approximately and 1960. It was one of the main fronts of the Algerian armed resistance and ultimately helped pave the way to independence. And so, as you can see, the war in the movie, in that first sequence, is narrated through just 3 shots. 2 wide shots of the Cité Climat de France and 1 of the city of Algiers, seen from that same housing project. This choice places the narration of the war and its experience on a local and individual level, through the vantage point of Omar and his apartment block. In this moment, the city's landscape becomes a surrogate for Omar's own experience of the war. Alwesh, the director, does something similar when introducing Omar's father. Though Omar speaks of the trauma of his father's death, he does so through images of the city. 2 shots of Algiers harbor and a close-up of a public lake portray the father and encapsulate the horror of the war in which he became. The sequence ends with Omar looking straight into the camera and saying about the war, "It's just a memory now. Bab El Oued is ours now. Our apartment is too small." The line functions much like the interplay between the close-up and the long shots. that we saw earlier. It takes us in just a few words from the grand national narrative of the war to the everyday frustrations of Omar's life, whose apartment is too small. When it premiered, Omar Gatlato marked a real turning point in Algerian cinema. It broke away from ideological, state-driven filmmaking. The Algerian critic and author Wassila Tamzali captured this shift beautifully in her book, Waiting for Omar Gatlato. She actually titled the book after the film, writing, "We were waiting for Omar Gatlato." Defying the old mummy that cinema had become, Alwesh plunged Algerian cinema in a bath of tenderness and revolt. In a recent interview, Tamzali reflected again on that historical shift. He said that Omar Gatlato, quote, announced the birth of the individual. The birth of the nation state was no longer our main preoccupation. It was replaced by a concern for the Algerian people, end quote. In my talk today, I want to draw attention to the ways Merzaq Alwesh and other artists have used Algiers and its built environment as an allegory of post-colonial emancipation, while also inscribing within it individual motives. At both the national and global level, actually, Algiers is often remembered as that symbol of anti-colonial struggle, first against the French and later in the 60s when international liberation movements set up their headquarters there, Black Panther in Algiers also. So to inhabit Algiers through personal, almost banal, sometimes poetic and fictional narratives, as Alwesh does, means constantly negotiating with that city's charged history, its symbolism and its reputation as the Mecca of revolutionaries, to borrow Amilcar Cabral's famous phrase. So let's take the Battle of Algiers, for example, one of the most iconic films of the post-independence period. It was a state-sponsored production, and it really helped cement the image of Algiers as a beacon of anti-colonial emancipation resistance. And it remains for many one of the first images that comes to mind when the city is mentioned. You'll notice, though, that in the Battle of Algiers, the city is never shown in wide shots. Instead, the film restages the battle through very tight frames, medium shots, keeping the camera close to the action to capture the immediacy of the struggle for control over the city. A decade later, Merzaq Alwesh takes an entirely different approach. And the line in the movie, "Now Bab el Wed is ours," this is just a memory now, "Now Bab el Wed is ours, our apartment is too small," situates his film in the aftermath of the Battle of Algiers. Alwesh turns to cinema, a medium favored by the nation state at the time for spreading propaganda, but uses it instead to assert personal agency over Algiers, experimenting with camera angles and perspectives from the vantage point of Climat de France. Through his cinematic treatment, those long urban shots and also close-ups of Algiers that frame the intimate story of Omar, Alwesh reimagines the city as a site of individual liberation. At the same time, the film reveals something else, the omnipresence of Algiers itself as a symbol, both empowering and overbearing times within the collective psyche. Photographer and writer Remarque, in her book, Algiers, Memories in Becoming, writes about the inevitable intertextuality between Algiers, its spatial memory, and the artworks in which it appears. What's striking in Remarque's concept of intertextuality is that she proposes Algiers as the underwriting of a palimpsest, a place whose shadow lingers beneath every new representation. And in the works I'm bringing together, that shadow is unmistakable. It's always that Algiers, the Algiers of the Battle of Algiers, that looms in the background, the official, the state-promoted anti-colonial capital. And it's against that image that Algerian artist Mohamed Khadda created his canvas, Les Casbahs ne s'assiègent pas. The Casbahs cannot be besieged. The painting shows the Casbah of Algiers frontally. So the Casbah was one of the key sites of the Battle of Algiers and resistance during the Battle of Algiers. And in the foreground, we see what looks like a battle. Shapes and signs tangled together, almost like a calligraphy in combat. And this battle, this clash, blocks our view of the city behind. At first glance, you might think the painting depicts the Battle of Algiers. But notice the date of the painting. Hadda started it 2 years before independence, in 1960, to finish it only 20 years after independence. That long span of time suggests that Hadda's painting is offering a reflection actually on the revolution itself, a meditation 20 years after independence. So according to Najet Hadda, who's the artist's wife and a historian of his work, the battle actually represents a struggle between what she calls the grand and small history, between the individual and the state. It's as though both sides are trying to seize Algiers for themselves. Hadda, in a sense, paints another battle of Algiers, one that takes place after independence. Much like Alwesh, what's really at stake here is the liberation of the individual. But the painting also reads as a deeply personal reflection on the artist's own relationship to the city. Remember, he held on to this work for more than 2 decades, continuously bringing modification, adding layers to the canvas. So the canvas cannot be besieged, becomes in a way a personal reaffirmation of faith in the revolutionary dream that Algiers symbolizes, no matter how fragile it had become. So I want to talk about another work, Assia Djebar's L'amour, la fantasia. And in that novel, L'amour, la fantasia, translated to English, Fantasia, an Algerian cavalcade, Djebar turned to Algiers as well as an anchor for emancipation. But this time in that book, she includes Algiers as part of a decolonial and feminist intellectual project. The book weaves together several histories. The French conquest of Algeria, imagined stories of women caught in that colonial violence, and the semi-autobiographical story of a girl growing up during the war liberation. Faced with an overwhelming archive of colonial writings and the near absence side of the colonized, Djebar turned to fiction and autobiography to reconstruct missing female voices. She opens her novel with the 1830 conquest of Algiers, intertwined with her own childhood memories. Titled The Capture of the City, or Love Letters. The first part of the novel echoes the gestures of Alwesh and Hadda, where once again, Algiers is conjured to inscribe discourses of emancipation. For Djebar, even though Algiers was free at the time she was writing the book, true liberation demanded something deeper, revisiting its history to liberate it from both colonial and patriarchal grips. Just opening the page of that first part. You can mute. Fast forward, Algiers still appears in contemporary art as a place of tension between collective and individual forms of liberation. And it also stands as a metaphor for questioning what remains of the post-colonial revolutionary dream. Algiers-based artist Amina Menia, in her film A Peculiar Family Album from 2012, weaves together autobiographical fiction with archival footage of Fernand Pouillon's housing projects. The voiceover recalls a hot summer day in Bevelwed in 2012, while the archival images take us back to the construction of Climat de France. So it's the same site that we saw earlier in Alwesh's film. Menia created this work during a wave of protests in Algeria when Algerians were demanding better living conditions and fair access to housing. By then, Climat de France had become a rundown complex, often stigmatized as a space of neglect and crime. In the film, Menia treats its construction in 1954, which coincided, mind you, with the outbreak of the War of Independence, as a kind of turning point, a moment charged with transformation and possibility. The footage of Algiers under construction helped dismantle the myth of the city monument, as if the narrator's voice were literally being inscribed in the stones beneath. Peculiar Family album shows once again how Algiers' past can be reactivated and reinscribed with the political demands of the present. And so I'm wrapping up, and we only have 10 minutes. But so what's striking in how in the examples I've shown, and there are so many more examples, but of course, I mean, the point was to choose a few examples across different mediums. Is how narratives of emancipation in all their different registers, personal, collective, or national, seem to keep returning to Algiers. And I think that's something truly unique about the city. Perhaps Algiers' history of liberation has become its own kind of captivity, a city forever summoned as a metaphor for freedom. And it makes wonder if Algiers would ever be able to escape the dream it came to embody.
اسموني عمر ولاد الحومه وشي مساغه من الخدمه يقولي قاتلات يعني رجله ساكنه فيا معناتها قاتلتني عندهم الحق عندي رجله هي صاحبتي نعم بعقليتي لازم الراجل يموت عني في الشهر وعلاش يربوا شلاف والرجال كيف فيها الدنيا كل راجل يسوى اخوه نسكن مع العائلة في واحد لاسيتي يسموها سيتي شوفالي جاية فوق باب الواد في حومتنا دايرين فينا بزاف الباطيمات 5 واقيلا كاين ثاني جبان في القطار غير سجور وحشاوش نجم نشوف منطقتي واحد الحي مبني تحت الطريق كان زمان في وقت الدربيك شغل حدود بينا وبين حومة القوار كان ليل كامل ورصاص يسيح صراحة كنت صغير هذاك الوقت مازلني شافتني عن النهار اللي دفنوا فيه الشيخ بابا الله يرحمه الإعلام اللي رفرف الزنقة الإعلام نتاعنا هذاك الوقت كان ممنوع الشيخ بابا الله يرحمه كان حمال في المارسو القنبلة نتاع باب الزيرة هي اللي قتلته هو اللي يتخدم معه هذا ما يتنساش يا بلادي مازلني شافتني على المظاهرات الشعب في الزنقة العسكر الجدرمية عقبنا حتى الدور هربت سلك الحلفة ديالي كنت دايما نبحرها نسلك من العسكر بصح كنت ناخذ كفوف نتاع العجزية الحلفة وهي بهذا الشيء باب الواد كثر المحايم ولا لينا برك الأغنية تقول باب الواد تاه الواد بصح دارنا صغيرة الله أكلنا الضيق يما ترقب.
Thank you so much.
Again, I'm Robert Desjarlais, also first name is known as Bob, kind of an international name. And I'm going to speak a bit about the new book, The Visual Afterlife of Abdelkadar Bennahar, which just came out about 2 weeks ago. And so this is really the book entails a story of life and death, more generally about the nature of life and death. And I draw from Jacques Derrida's concept of life, death, la vie, la mort, talk about almost like a field of the interplay between life and death. It's also a story of one particular person's life and as well as the death. And this is Abdelkadar Bennahar. But I think I'd like to think of the book as well as really a reflection on life more generally for all of us. And the book emerged, the project for the book emerged out of
the book Traces of Violence that Halil Hebri and I worked on for several years together, which came out 5 years ago now, something like that. I think it was through my conversations with Halil, especially, that I learned about the events of October 17th, 1961. And I'm sure many of you know about this in Paris. On that night, thousands of people from Algeria who were living, particularly in the banlieue around surrounding Paris, came to the center of the city to protest colonial rule. And it was very peaceful protest, demonstration, but the Paris police were waiting for them. They were waiting at bridges and bus stops, metro stations, and by some accounts, over 200 Algerians were killed, and hundreds of others were wounded. And this is just a chronocartography by Leopold Lambert about where the sites of interaction and the clashes mostly occurred in the Paris region. And these are just some of the photographs from that time, which I'm sure some of you are familiar with. It says, "Ici on noie les Algériens," here we drown Algerians, which was inscribed on the side of the whatever you would call this, the concrete sort of embankment along the Seine, and just across from there was the prefecture of the Paris police. I think it's still in the same location. And so the book really sort of engages with themes of censorship, of denial, of dissimulation and collective memory, and also how collective memory is understood from an Algerian perspective, and also this dynamic of post-memory that a scholar at Columbia, I believe, Marianne Hirsch, has advocated. And so one thing to note is the events of October 1961, as Joshua Polk puts it, they entered history in the 1980s. These events were very much forgotten and kind of effaced through historical memory. And then there is waves of historical research and memory activist groups. But I think still it's largely unprocessed, particularly in France, as well as other dynamics of French colonialism in North Africa and elsewhere. So I've undertaken a kind of what I would, you can call a phenomenological archaeology of these events, particularly with the life and death of Abdelkadar Bennahar. And the reason I know about this person is because a series of photographs were taken of Bennahar the night of October 17th by a Jewish French photographer, Elie Kagan. And these circulate. If you pulled out your cell phones right now, you could easily locate them. For a long time, the name of the person photographed was not known, at least in France, by Kagan and other historians. And I'll tell later about how the name became more sort of clear to many people. I'll skip this. So the book is also about several intersecting lives and deaths. So you have the life of Bennahar, of Kagan, and also historian Jean-Luc Einaudi, who wrote a lot about these events. Einaudi was based in Paris. There's Kagan. And Kagan, the night of October 17th, I think he was sort of tipped off to the demonstrations, and he started to move around. At first, he had a Vespa scooter, and he was going to different places. Kagan lived in the 10th arrondissement, so it was easy to get to certain places. And these photographs have become, in some ways, iconic of that evening. And then, so these are photographs he's well known for, the metro stations in Paris. And this is just one unlocatable photograph. It's titled by Kagan as Abandoned Bicycle. I don't know where this was actually photographed. And the archivist at the museum, at the Contemporary, where his collective works are held, do not know where it was located either. And Kagan went to, excuse my pronunciation, the Pont de Nuit, that's close enough, just on the border between France and the banlieue, like close to Nanterre, to do some more photographs. And he took another series of photographs there. And then he heard on a radio dispatch, perhaps even the police dispatch, that there were gunshots in it's this area known as Petit Nanterre in Nanterre. So he took his Vespa there. I want to note I'm going to show a series of photographs, and there is a dead body shown in some of them, just to give you a heads up. And again, I have this ambivalence of showing the photographs, but I think it's important for the historical record, and that ambivalence is sort of sears through the whole book overall. So these are the photographs that Kagan took. There's Bennahar is lying on the ground here, and you can see these photographs. Kagan heard someone say, and he says he assumed it was Algerians who were sort of hiding out to the side. Let him, he's taking photographs, let him do it. So they, in a way, there's a kind of agency of the people who are looking on the scene to permit Kagan to take these photographs, I think with the implication that he would be able to circulate them. So he took a series of photographs of Bennahar. He also heard someone who he thinks it was the police, maybe a couple hundred meters away, saying there are flashes, there are flashes. And so he felt he had to work quickly, or he could face it. So it's unclear who had beaten up Bennahar and killed these other people. I think, and I think it's accurate, it was probably Paris police officers who were going on these ratanades, these manhunts that night to look for Algerians to beat up and to kill. But again, it's unclear exactly what happened. So as Bennahar was taking these photographs, as Kagan was taking these photographs, an American journalist showed up. I don't know who this is. And he spoke with Kagan and said, like, what are you doing? This man's lying on the ground. He's clearly in pain, and you're taking photographs of him. And Kagan sort of shot back and said, if you're so charitable, let's use your car and we'll take him to the hospital in Nanterre. So that's what they did. And Kagan continued to take the photographs. And these are the last photographs taken. So Bennahar was brought to the hospital. It's unclear what happened after that. The next night he was reported killed in another clash between Algerian protesters in Cologne and the French police officers. And so there are accounts of it. And Bennahar was found lying dead in the aftermath of that collision. So it's unclear. There's some reports that he was sort of a police van rode over him, but it's quite possible that his body was planted there as well. So what I've been trying to do is figure out, I know so little about who Bennahar was in life, and mostly I have sort of a few archival traces of his existence, and I've been trying to trace out who he was and also what happened in the final days of his life, and then this long history of the afterlife of him, particularly the visual images. The deaths, there were 2 deaths in Cologne that night of this violent encounter. And so that's one trace. His name was misspelled wrong there. And so one way a useful concept is by Ariella Azoulay from her book, The Civil Imagination, that the photographic event is the actual event of someone taking a photograph. I should say the event, there's a photograph of the event, but the photographic event can go on for years. And I think that's the case with these images. And I tend to think of these images as wound images. They're both images of wounding, but also these images can wound and have the capacity to wound even today. And also the concept of image drift. These images have drifted through time. And there's a strong sense of multiplication of the images and the proliferation, particularly in the contemporary moment with how quickly images move throughout the world. And I've been consulting multiple archives through this research. So there's the archives and databases of Le Contemporain. They have a collection for the photographs, all the photographs of Abdelkadar. There's the archives of the Paris police, and particularly I've been looking at the morgue record books from 1961 with the Institut Médico-Légal of Paris. And then there's also digital archives of the Parisian cemetery. So I've been doing this archival research to find sort of records of Bennahar being brought to the morgue and then also then being buried in the cemetery of Thiers, which is on the outskirts of Paris. These are just some of them, the records. And I've also been to the cemetery where he's been buried. And this is in Division 797. The cemetery in Thiers is there's different divisions for different, I think, particularly religious denominations. And so this is a division for people who identified as being Muslim. And Bennahar was buried somewhere in this field. And just in contrast, you can see this is a division for military soldiers who fought for France. But also this front row here is for the auxiliary police officers, often known as the Harkis, les Harkis, who fought on the French side during the Algerian War of Independence. And so I've been working with everything, a close reading of contact sheets, to all the different, at least according to what I can find, the different ways these images have circulated from October 1961. See the different images, how they sort of appeared in different publications. This is a film, Jacques Panigel, which I believe was shown at Columbia a couple of weeks ago, and that the images are found there as well. One person who didn't like these images as well, understandably, is Maurice Papon, who was the prefect of the Paris police from 1958 to 1965. He said that they were fake. He didn't believe in the images, Kagan's photographs, and he said, I don't believe it, it's a montage. In other words, they were photoshopped. But I think there's a clear record of them, the photographs being authentic. And so Kagan himself was deeply affected by this event. For one, it sort of marked his history as a photojournalist, a freelance photographer, but also this was a kind of kind of a recurrent spectral return of his own life as a child. In 1942, he had to leave Paris. He was one of the enfants cachés who had to go hide out in the countryside. And I think it brought back memories of being hunted by French police officers, members of his family and his friends at the time. Kagan also went to the Bidonville of Nanterre in October 1961 and took a series of photographs of Algerian families there. And I think he was trying to find Bennahar. And I could easily imagine he had copies of the photograph. There's no record of him finding out, but you can again see how there's a collage of the images and how newspapers were telling stories at the time, drawing from these images. The important book that came out in 1991, I believe, is by Jean-Luc Anodi. Again, you see the image on the cover of the book, La Bataille de Paris. This is a paperback post version of the book. So again, how these images circulate. And then Kagan, and then this is a book that the two put together. The way that Anodi learned the name of the man who was being photographed by Kagan, he went to a conference in Algeria. I believe it was 1999. And a man came up to him and said, "I've been wanting to meet you for years. The man on the cover of your books, that was my uncle." And we never knew what happened to him. We heard rumors that he had been killed and was buried in a cemetery. But when we saw this image on the book, and there's a couple of other images in the book itself, we formally identified him as being a member of our family. And so almost it was like a kind of act of recognition. And then this had reverberations for the family as well. This is just a Google image search that I did in December 2023. I just typed in Bennahar and Kagan, and a whole set of different images came up, but you can see how they circulate today in many different ways. And one could think of that there's further developments of the image. I'm thinking of the word development here from Katia Silverman, who has a wonderful book, The Miracle of Analogy, the way photographs sort of have, she calls it an unstoppable development. In the early time of photography, like in the 1850s, 1860s, when people were first developing the technology, particularly the technology of fixing photographs, the photographs would still develop overnight. People would make the prints, and then they would come back the next morning and they were darkened because of the light. And so she uses it as a metaphor for the ways that often photographs develop through time. There's different meanings and interpretations to the images. And one thing I want to note is that an artist based in France, Eric Manigault, who said basically his approach to artwork is he uses a big screen like this and he puts like white canvas on it and he projects the image, the photographic image, and then he uses charcoal and pencil to trace out the image in a dark room. And what appears through that is another image. And so this is a copy of one of his images. And you can see how it's similar to the photograph. And again, with the abandoned bicycle, this is his graphite drawing of the image. And you can see the difference with the actual photograph itself. And this is the image that's on the cover of the book with the permission of the artist. And so, yeah, maybe I could stop there. I think perhaps that gives an overview of it. Okay, thank you. Thank you.
Thank you to Steph, Pam, and Amy, and to all of you for coming. So basically, while I'm focusing on the work of this one artist, Franco-Algerian artist Katia Kameli, and a documentary film that she's made, I think that there'll be resonances with both Beya and Bob's presentations. So I'm currently finishing a book on basically the kind of Franco-Algerian relations after 1960, post-colonial relations, and it's really heavily based on state archives, even though it deals with a lot of very personal and family stories. And the idea for the epilogue of my book is actually to think about, which is related to the arguments that I'm making in it, what it means or how one can go about writing histories beyond the archives and the narratives of the nation state. So I think you'll hear some clear resonances here with some of the things that Beya laid out in her her presentation. And so I've turned to the work of Katia Kameli, who is herself Franco-Algerian and has certain ties to the stories that I'm telling in the book as a place to begin thinking about that. So this specific piece was commissioned for by Ariel Azoulay and Abdel Ben Bella for a special issue of Expression Maghrébine. But it's the kind of place where I'm beginning to sketch out the thoughts that I want to develop in the epilogue to my book. So I'm just going to go ahead and read. And what follows is something of a kind of thick description of the three-part documentary that Kameli has made, which I hope will give you a sense of how she, in her work, goes about developing this kind of alternative understanding of history. Doing myself. So a woman sifts through a stack of old postcards of Algiers. We see her hands holding faded documents of the city's colonial past. In that era, landscape views visually possessed the territory in ways that paralleled the visual seizure of Algerian women in contemporary ethnographic postcards. Version of the presentation that it is, but we'll work with it. I sent the wrong version. So landscape views visually possessed the territory in ways that paralleled the visual seizure of Algerian women in contemporary ethnographic postcards. Filming from her point of view in the present, the camera's eye reverses the perspective of staged studio portraits of yore. We don't see her, we see her looking. She slowly places one card behind the other. Passing them in review, she dislodges colonial scopic and architectural projects that appropriated and ordered the city and its inhabitants. And I specifically took this picture of the slightly blurred image to give you a sense of the movement that is produced in the film. So blurring as she moves them, the seemingly stable images of spatial and spectatorial control come in and out of focus. In the background, hundreds of postcards are arrayed on an outdoor wall in the middle of the city. Others are jumbled together in bins below. The stage for this scene is an outdoor kiosk where its owner, Aruz Azoug, displays his card collection. For decades, he has made affordable reproductions available to passersby for the symbolic price of 20 dinars. Clichés of Alger la Blanche and of the colonial harem appear alongside those of the heroes and heroines of the revolution and celebration of Algiers as the capital of the third world or the Mecca of revolution. Unstructured by conventional political, national, and gendered historical narratives, Azoug's unofficial archive invites the city's pedestrian public, which the film shows them kind of walking by this kiosk and stopping and lingering. So unstructured by a conventional political, national, and gendered historical narratives, Azoug's unofficial archive invites the city's pedestrian public to reconstruct their own history by reflecting on these sepia-toned cards. The camera peers over her shoulder. While we can't know it, the hands belong to the documentary's creator, Katia Kameli. At the same time, we hear a woman's voice. Eschewing omniscient narration, she wonders aloud about the attraction exerted by the faded cards. Why linger over these artifacts designed to shore up since vanquished colonial power? Do they represent persistent domination or its historical defeat, subjugation or survival? Living on as what Anne Stoller calls imperial debris, they are at once past and present, foreign and familiar. It has always interpolated me, she says at the kiosk, this longing we have to find these representations of Algiers, these women, all these personalities that we find on these old cards. Her insistent questioning creates an overture. She continues, why this desire? Why return to that? What is it that makes this sort of image interesting? Successive chapters of Kameli's film, Le Roman Algérien, suture multiple answers to the desire and necessity of returning to images of the Algerian past. Creating a film within a film, the scene appears in the opening minutes of the documentary's first chapter. In the closing credits, we learn that the woman's voice belongs to Dalila Kadi Hanifi, a noted author, actress, and mathematician. When we first hear her, she is anonymous, a woman on the street, a flaneuse in the urban crowd. Personally drawn to the card, she speaks to a collective longing. Look at the images, but also to tell and hear the stories that they summon. Kameli collects this polyphonie de récit. Her innovative novel draws out narratives prompted by this collective personal desire. Revisiting images and scenes from multiple perspectives and over time, film presents a multi-layered, multivocal, and multilingual response. Stitching those stories together, the roman algérien does not aim for closure. It open a space for a future return. And here I think the resonances with what Beya said. At the kiosk and in the film, old images take on a new public life. The faded photograph is, in Ariella Aisha Azouley's words, out there, an object in the world, and anyone, always at least in principle, can pull at one of its threads and trace it in such a way as to reopen the image and renegotiate what it shows, possibly even completely overturning what was seen in it before, which I think resonates with what you were saying about development. Kameli's film pulls on these threads, revealing the gaps and sutures of official national histories. It weaves the strands together to create an alternative vision of Algeria's past, present, and future. Arrayed on the wall of the Banque Nationale d'Algérie, which is this. The images are hung up by clothespins. That kind of domestic touch is striking. Azoug and his son mount the cards, photos, and posters every morning and take them down in the evening, as we see in a scene at the end of the film's first chapter. The kiosk's daily ritual regularly reorders them in a contingent and impermanent assemblage. Housed in this temporary structure, they are not bound by a chronological and classificatory architecture of state archives. Official archival institutions, as Jacques Derrida suggestively noted, place documents under house arrest, conditioning not only who can access them, but whose histories they tell and how. They have a genealogical relationship to the domiciles of ancient Greek magistrates or archons who guarded political and legal documents. For Derrida, they instituted paternal law and preserved its filiation while remaining haunted by potential destitution. Since the 19th century, official archives have served as the ground for patriarchal and orientalizing fantasies of rescue and retrieval by historians who imagine themselves to be forcing open the gates of this harem. An attribute of sovereignty, archives were supposed to secure states' monopolies on the history of violence. They still do. Struggles over the possession of their contents remain an ongoing different in contests between the French and Algerian states. As rendered in Kameli's film, Azoug and his son do not pursue patriarchal and political control. They hand over the keys, opening their temporary house to the city. So again, I think that resonates with the place of the city here. As one of Kameli's interlocutor notes, in present-day Algeria, history belongs to the state. By placing this array of images on public display, the kiosk allows citizens to break free of that control. Towards the end of the film, a history student comments on the photographs of politically dissident figures like Messali Haj that appear alongside the colonial era postcards. Flipping through old photographs, she reflects on the subsequent vilification of those who were sidelined and their present absence from what she learned in school. The cards and photos mark a visual return of the historically repressed. In doing so, they make archival erasure and narrative silencing perceptible. Displayed on the outside of an official building, the images exceed existing architectural and disciplinary frames. In centering this open space, Kameli's film renders the kiosk as a paradoxically an archival institution. Its impermanent display disrupts both colonial and national monopolies on the shape and meaning of the past. Among the photographs that Kameli revisits is one of the celebrated FLN militant Jamila Bouhired, who was tortured and condemned to death by the French in 1957 and heralded across the Third World as an icon of anti-colonial struggle. Released from prison at the end of the war, she became an official envoy of the new Algerian state. Taken during her tour of the Middle East in fall 1962, the photo captures her as a symbol of the young nation's progress. She appears alongside her fellow revolutionary Zora Dreyf, confidently shaking Egyptian President Nasser's hand. In this image, she is a young and smiling symbol of the revolution's emancipatory promise, including for Algerian women. Kameli and her interlocutors circle back to this image of Bouhired over the course of Le Roman. We see it first in passing at the kiosk in the first chapter, as a woman reaches out her hand to touch the picture and reconnect with the revolutionary heroine who later retreated from public life as the revolution's promissory note to women remained unfulfilled. This gesture and the camera's frame center the young Jamila in a sea of pictures of the male leaders who took control of the Algerian state and its history thereafter. For a moment, the passerby establishes a connection to a future past. I should say. Following a recursive structure, Kameli's work returns to the photo not to pin it down, but to overlay it with additional meanings. This evocative scene and image resurface in the second chapter, which has a palimpsestic relationship to the first. As the second film opens, we watch a lone spectator, Marie-Josée Monzin, a French art historian and philosopher who was born in Algiers. She is screening the first chapter in a darkened theater, right? So we see this kind of palimpsestic, kind of constant overlaying of the meaning of images. So she's sitting in a darkened theater watching in silence. We hear her commenting later on what she has seen. The temporal caesura between image and sound opens up a space of reflection prompted by Monzin's own. Leaving her place in the audience, Monzin is no longer passive spectators. Is no passive spectator sutured by a classic film imaginary. She walks in front of the screen, crossing the projector's illumination as the film plays. Framed as a visually split subject, she and her shadow return to the first chapter with a difference. As she traverses the frame, the scene of the woman touching Jamila Bouhired appears on the screen. Mise on a beam and those that follow cast the apparently fixed image in a new light and shadow. The next scene is suggestively titled L'invu, or the unseen. Its opening shot returns again to the image of the handshake, offering yet another take. Here. The camera pans over the photo, giving it the appearance of movement. Lebanese singer Fayrouz's famous 1959 song, Letter to Jamila, and at once mournful and hopeful tribute to the then imprisoned revolutionary heroine plays. Camera lingers briefly on her enigmatic smile. The film then abruptly cuts. We next see Monzin, now watching, not in a traditional theater, but on a small iPad screen. She reviews an interview with the feminist jurist and activist, Vassilia Tamzali, that we just heard. We too watch as Tamzali offers her own take on the images that we have already seen. For Tamzali, the photos of the young revolutionaries summon a story of disillusion, a loss and deception of past hopes and myths. Casting a look backwards from the present, she sees them as already portending an eventual fall. Beneath the smiling and confident visages of Ben Bella and Bouteflika, she detects the darker turns that the nation's post-colonial history would take. It is in this tragic light that she views the now familiar photograph of Bouhired and our heroines, she calls them, and you see through that's the photograph that she's looking at. For Tamzali, the image distills, quote, the entire iconography of decolonization. How am I on time?
A couple more minutes.
Okay, including everything that it hid. The somber present casts a shadow for Tamzali. Explains the entire situation in which we find ourselves is contained in that handshake. Already at the beginning, she suggests, a tragic fate, most notably for Algerian women, was sealed. Rather than closing the book at this point, the second chapter keeps this and other images' potential histories open. Was this tragic telos there, if unseen, at the origin? Kameli zooms out again, returning to Monzon. Full of admiration for Kameli, she offers an alternative to knowing historicism. Monzon instead proposes returning to the image anew in order to better seize its indeterminate past, present, and pulls on that thread. These young women, she notes, could not know that after the fact it might be seen as an abdication. Her account points to a different unseen, an imminent potential unconstrained by what later came to pass. This other unseen is not yet, rather than a hidden fixed truth. In her view, we cannot control images. Their perpetual revolutionary reserve resists historical seizure. The final segment of the chapter focuses on the story of another revolutionary heroine, Louisette Hilariz. Decades later, she is seated at an outdoor table with Kameli, an array of photographs between them. She selects one of the Algerian flag and proceeds to recount the belle histoire of how she had instructed women in the midst of the revolution to reproduce it without an original. Given the danger of carrying the actual flag, she describes preserving it in her mind's eye. She reconstructs the image for Kameli as she had for them. 2 stitched panels, 1 green, 1 white, with the red crescent and star positioned just so. Without a fixed pattern, the flags that proliferated at the advent of liberation were personal and communal at once. Hilariz recalls a women's essential, if unseen, role in the revolution. They literally and figuratively stitched the nation and its unifying symbol together. In reviewing their interview, Monzon draws out the significance of this plural origin. She comments on how the flag, like a film, is stitched together from multiple parts, making it a powerful metaphor for the nation itself. The still live memory reveals, in her view, the historical potential of emblems. On display at the kiosk, the Algerian flag maintains all of its virulent potential, that's Monzon's phrase. Pulling on the thread of its now standardized and seamless national stitching, Kameli loosens official hold on the emblem by recalling its history. In advance of Independence Day, women undid the threads of old clothes, including their wedding dresses, to sew together new national costumes and flags. They became, as Malika Rahal has suggested, the symbol of an intimately lived Renaissance. The second chapter's coda, movie clips of newly independent Algerians waving the flag, recasts those iconic images of national birth by centering women's historical handiwork in fabricating the national symbol. In revisiting Hilariz's story and photographs with hand-sewn flags, Kameli picks up this recreative potential by highlighting rather than hiding their creative suturing. Seen in retrospect, the second chapter's ending appears prophetic in its foreshadowing of the immense popular uprising that unfolded across Algeria in 2019-2020. Kameli returned to film yet another installment of the roman during the massive protest movement against aging President Abdelaziz Bouteflika's bid to pursue a 5th term. The Remarque's iterative performance brought thousands of people into the streets and out onto balconies every Friday in cities across the country. Marchers, young and old, Arab and Berber, men and women, famously reappropriated the emblems of the revolution, including the Algerian national flag. Kameli's third chapter captures the dynamism of this and other potential images set in motion by citizens, creating both national history and with it, the nation's future anew. Okay, 1 minute. Made in multiple installments in 2015, 2017, and 2019, Kameli's roman Algérien performatively enacts an understanding of history that is open to an alternative national future. Anticipating, situating, and extending the Remarque, it contributes to the project of recasting a national story that, as Fatima Usadik has suggested, is central to the renewal of democratic power in Algeria. It demonstrates how historical perspective shifts, not only by centering citizens over the state, but also in and over time. Each chapter casts the previous one in a new light, not yet visible from the point of view of the previous present. Sorry, that's a little. I think you get the idea. While structured as a sequence, the chapters do not frame the relationship between past, present, and future as linear or unidirectional, unfolding in the homogeneous empty time of the state. These looping threads connecting them move back and forth in time. Rendered visible, they are ready to be picked up again in the future. Kameli's experimental novel film thus remains, like the kiosk and its kaleidoscopic display, open-ended. The film set images in motion, dislodging their apparent historical fixity. This revision points to the futures that wait to be rediscovered in images of the past in ways that keep history and its potential alive. Thank you. Yes.
All right, floor is open. Well, do you want to ask this?
Yes, also a quick question.
If you don't mind with, in each case, introducing yourselves very quickly.
My name is William Pimlott. I work at the CSA across the corridor. I wanted to ask you about the emancipatory potential of that housing block, the Cité. Because you're saying also Algeria had this great potential as a emancipatory symbol for anti-colonialism, post-colonialism. That Cité and the shot you had of the French guy who built it, and then the fact that in Nanterre and in Paris, their own Cité come to resemble the Cité of Algeria. All across the world, people build these big buildings that are meant to give people dignity, safe housing, and by the end of the century, they're viewed as decline, crime. I just wondered if you had any thoughts of the building at the center of that story.
Sure. I mean, I have, there's a scholar, Katrina, people. Book about, and has a whole chapter where she talks about that cité in the post-colonial imaginary. And she picks different cités in the Maghreb. But that cité has an interesting history. And again, I'm not an expert, I'm not an urban historian, but Fernand Pouillon, who is a French architect, built it in the 1950s, and he claimed that when he built it, he wanted to offer decent and dignified housing to the Algerian indigenous people. And it was one of the first housing projects that was aimed for the so-called indigenous population of Algeria that the French were undertaking at that time. And scholars like Zineb Selik, who are historians of Algiers, have completely criticized his approach, saying that actually, like looking at the details of the architecture and showing how the architecture actually almost paternalized the Algerians and did not actually offer dignified housing conditions. But that is not really the point. The point is that Fernand Pouillon, strangely, after independence, he became one of the main architects of post-colonial in Algeria. He lived 20 years after independence in Algeria, and he was hired by the Algerian state to build so many different sites, cities, hotels, tourist villages. And so for a lot of Algerians, I mean, again, I can't speak for Algerians, all of them, but for Amina Meni, at least when we had that conversation, I told her, but why did you choose Cité Climat de France? Project that is built by a French guy during colonization. How can that represent emancipation for you? She said, no, but actually, Pouillon, for us, citizens of Algiers, he doesn't represent colonization. He represents actually that post-colonial moment of infrastructural investment and development. And so that's interesting, but I mean, it's really not my area of expertise.
Hi, my name is Bayan. I'm a PhD in history at Yale. I focus on Southern Sudan. And so, yeah, all of your talks sort of spoke to things I've been reading for a long time. And this question is directed to all of you. But I'm kind of interested in like what you all think the parameters of the city are, and especially like the haunted city, because I feel like the sort of spectrum of violence that haunts Algeria extends far past it and extends far past like the memory of Algerians. In many ways, like there's similar trends in like Ho Chi Minh or Beirut or sort of other like constellations of French Empire that are to do with this like violence. So going back to what you were saying, Beya, in the beginning of your presentation about this relationship between the individual and the collective, like I'm just wondering how these sorts of universal memories of violence expand the parameters of the city. Yeah, I know it's an easy question, so.
I don't have an easy answer. I think one of you used the word the palimpsest. The city is palimpsest, and that's a key metaphor for me. I'm now working on a film project on Berlin, and just sort of the layers of inscription and re-inscription within the space of a city, but this works through time and across space as well, and then within the imaginary. And so at least that's my approach to thinking about Paris and almost like a rhizomatic place, not just within one particular configuration, but through time and through these complexities of different dynamics going on, different almost like a kind of strange physics of a city, almost like a quantum theory about how things are intersecting between cities and other places and times. So I'm not sure if that's an answer, but.
Well, I guess one thing that I think speaks that, which I didn't foreground in my presentation, is that one of the kind of unseen aspects in Kameli's film is the sense that is referenced all the time is in fact the absence of images, the kind of haunting absence of images from the period of the Civil War, the Black Decade, right? And so that there's a way in which the return to the kind of life of the city and the this kind of profusion of these kind of pictures of both the colonial era and of the kind of high watermark resonate. Part of what she's exploring is the way in which they resonate in really different ways after the Black Decade, and to have this kind of profusion of images, there's a kind of reattachment to them and a re-signification of them. Which I guess is sort of interesting in terms of thinking about the relationship between the kind of the absent presence of the violence behind the overturning, literally, right, of the images of the colonial past and of the past heroism of the revolutionary moment.
Shaheen Valley, I'm a fellow at Remarque. Just a remark on Pouillon. I know that the images in the film maybe don't give it justice, and it looks from the distance like a cité in the French suburbs, but actually architecturally, Pouillon is really a master. And I think from the distance it looks like a very low quality building, but it's actually not. And in fact, some of the buildings that Pouillon has made even before these in Marseille, for instance, has redone the whole east side of the bank of the Vieux Port, and these are like pretty bourgeois, very high class, high standing buildings. Actually, I had a question about October 61. My recollection is that in the French scholarship and in the French debate, there is still no precise number of dead and wounded during that day. Have you come across either in your archival work or in others like a more precise account of that? Because I think that's still a sour point in the memory work around that date, is that the French are still very mysterious. There's no complete openness of the police archives, if I'm correct.
I would agree with there's no precise number. These are all estimates, and for a while there was sort of what people were calling the battle of numbers. There were different historians. There was one historian, I think, who worked with the permission of the police to work in the archives. He was at the Sorbonne. He said that maybe like 30 people had died. And then I know they said it was over 200. These both are sort of perhaps exaggerations either way, but I don't think there's any way knowing now how many people died, because a lot of the deaths were not brought to the morgues. And according to certain personal accounts, is that bodies were thrown into the Seine or buried, and so it's really hard to determine how many people died then.
I have a slight footnote on
Sure,
that, which is just that, I think that, Josh Cole's evaluation and, since then of the kind of resurgence of the, kind of memory in the 1980s in
Right.
France is true, with a notable exception, which is to say in the Algerian emigre community. I mean, in fact, October 17th was the National Day of Immigration. And was like the kind of official newspaper of the, emigres on every October 17th, so like, it's just important to remember that there like actually were people in France, right, which sometimes in the recounting of the kind of repression of the history, like, gets, obscured.
Yeah, these counter memories. And every October 17th, I think there are still collective memorials. People congregate near this end.
Right,
by Paul's
right.
office.
But this was happening like basically starting in the late 1960s.
Okay.
This is not, it was part of the, it was, it had a complicated history because of course, like it was part of the Algerian state's effort to kind of exercise political influence and kind of control over the potentially, kind of restive and oppositional emigre community, but like the memorialization of October 17th on the Algerian side, including for, migrants in France from the late 60s through the 1970s was, a kind of yearly big event.
Actually, I want to steal for a question. But it's two very different questions. One is, these are very messy images. I mean, I guess by necessity in some cases, and others very curatedly so. I wanted to ask you what you think of this in the kind of management of this messiness. Brings me to the second question, which is, I wondered what you think of your own work of commentary or writing on images that lean upon historical events, but as you know, you sort of have both the capacity to change historically, to change over time, and the capacity to be much more, let's say, at times much more playful as to the directions in which the images go, with an agency all of their own. Bob, you write beautifully in the book about trying to make sense of what this is. And it feels like there's both a kind of constraint, there's a kind of constraining factor on the messiness, but also a kind of enabling factor of this trickier sense of tension within. Tension within the work, tension in Beya's presentation as well, between the kind of national image and the guy with his talk that has a hole in it. Speaks about the virility of sort of almost bursting into his song. So I'm very curious about how you think about the determinants or what goes into judging exactly how you write or exactly how you present, how you manage or control your place. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I would agree. Like these images, the way the metaphor I use in the book is that they're spore-like. Same way some kind of a mushroom, say, or a fungus will just generate spores, and you never know how they're gonna end up. They could sort of go and germinate somewhere else, or by sort of inert. That the images are sort of like that. With all of our lives, we're constantly generating these spores, and these images end up they're kind of wild images in that respect. The archive of Kagan's photographs is very orderly, as archives are, and every image has a documentary sort of signifier with it. They're now, the originals are kept in these light boxes, and now there's a digital archive as well. And Kagan's work is just this proliferation of images too, very systematic. When in terms of my own writing, I feel like this responsibility and a carefulness to write about the histories involved in very careful ways. But at the same time, if you've read some of the book, there are these sort of musings and reflections that are very imaginative about the possibilities of the photographs, including how they might have worked and reached the family members in Algeria. And so there's a kind of tension there, I would say, between messiness, the attempt to try to create a kind of precise historical record, an archival record, and then the way all of these images are the same with these, like they promote imaginings and in a very fantastical way quite often too. And so I don't want to, in the book itself, I don't want to tame down that messiness or the fantastical qualities, but somehow sort of reflect it through the writing. It's
Happy you got to say this. What's that? I'm happy you got to say this actually because of how beautiful the book is.
So I'll just, quickly say that, I guess what I've really sort of tried to learn from, kind of engaging with people who work on images who are not necessarily historians, right, is to think more and think with that, what you describe as agency of images, or I would say like the agency of the audience of images, right, and, so part of what, I was kind of learning and experimenting with and thinking with Kameli's film, right, is how to think about images not just as kind of illustrative documents, but rather as generative and productive of other ways of thinking about history.
When you speak about messiness, I just want to, you're mentioning, you're referring to the fact that in its presentation, artist was like displaying a stack of messy images and in mind the hole in the sock.
But not necessarily the hole in the sock, the sense of like, I kind of need to, I was thinking more that there's a kind of commitment and everydayness to these, and therefore like the images are not curated. It's not this sort of trying to find, I'm really desperately trying to find like a better way of saying like, it's not a kind of like super Protestant order to it, but it's a little bit like a kind of overflowing sense, both in what is being depicted and in the way that images upon images then go, so that you're trying to figure out what it is that you're looking at the same time as you recognize or can isolate particular elements, and then they've sort of disappeared again, and there's like 30 other things. Messiness I thought was creative. It wasn't a judgment on his living room.
Yeah. I mean, I'll take an example, for instance, for the book of Desjarlais. So many people have read it and said, that it's not accessible because it feels as though it's messy. You have archival recollections, actually, citing document by document what has been said about the conquest of Algeria, intertwined with autobiographical narratives, intertwined with fictional histories about anonymous women. And then I feel like this messiness really amplifying that idea that there's so much to process. And then when it arrives to the level of the artist, there's no way to curate it because the quantity of history, of material, of historical material and document to process is a consequence that you have to just find a way to make sense out of that quantity. Yeah, I think if anything, I read it as something telling of the weight of the necessity of artists. Tackle it, front it all together. Yeah. Going smaller doors.
Khalil?
Thank you all for your presentations. My name is Khalil Habreh. I'm a postdoctoral fellow at Parsons and a colleague in front of Robert. We work together. So I at first a sort of reaction to something Judith Surkis said about the memory of the 1961 massacre, and it was indeed an object of political memory very quickly after by the FLN and by the FLN offshoots in France that eventually became these organizations that organized, coordinated immigrants' life in the country. But it still remained within the non-dit, the space of unsettledness within families, so that this memory, if you were interested in it, you had to seek it out outside of the family, despite your grandparents being fully aware of it. And for that event having shaped their own political expressions. And so that this very intimate renaissance, I think you mentioned from Abdelkadar Hall's work, is also part of this unsaid space, which then needs people who are descendants of that situation without inheriting the full memory of it to have a tendency to heroize their grandparents, but also all of the supposed actors of a revolution have difficulty placing their own ancestry within that historical sequence. So my question is, It's not a question, it's sort of invitation. Could you say more about heroism, heroification? And I feel like there's a tension between the images that Robert proposes and the ones that Beya Othmani includes, and especially that sequence, that passage from revolutionary and official state memory to something that's more Algerian, actually, but less legible. Yeah, so can you say more about heroes and complicate the narrative about the heroics of Algerian revolution?
Sure, why don't you?
I mean, yeah, briefly. When I was writing the lecture, I realized, I mean, it's kind of obvious that what Alwesh is doing is also creating an anti-hero with Omar Gatlato, all in his sock, and he's loud when he's yawning, and he's like his bodily presence is really giving a counterpoint to the heroic image of the independence fighter that has been also, you can claim, appropriated by the nation state to claim legitimacy for decades. I mean, until now, the same political party has been in power since 1962, and so you understand with the film of Omar Gatlato, and there are the films of that period that I didn't mention. One of them is Solid Tahia Dido by Ahmed Zinet, that artists are creating these characters, placing them in that period of, he's talking about his experience of the war and how he lost his father in a bomb attack, but at the same time, you understand the importance of the creating the anti-hero to counter the monopoly of things.
And I think that I was sort of implicit in what I was trying to trace out, but I think that that's part of Katia Kameli's project as well, right? By centering the women who, were sort of held up as heroines, but then, as in Bouillet's case, exits public life. And then it's significant that they then come back in the Remarque in 2019. And as a result, why that, kind of remains, despite, once again, another history of disappointment, a kind of touchstone for thinking about a kind of alternative future. Although I do think that there's an interesting and suggestive, tension between what you had to say about the kind of revolution, to what extent the kind of, even in the kind of, returning or revising of the heroic mythology of the revolution, political imaginaries still seem to be tied to it in some way. Whereas I think, Kameli is, does try to reactivate it, although there is a chapter 4 that she's working on. And so that, as I sort of tried to suggest, the story is, remains unfinished. But the kind of question of recentering the women rather than the male heroes of the revolution who, took over the state is part of what she's, up to.
I don't know if there's any heroes in this book. I don't think Bennahar has been portrayed that way by anyone. I think Kagan almost created a kind of mythology. He was the intrepid photographer going from place to place and, putting his own life at risk to create these images and to circulate them. One thing maybe I could note is that in terms of the scholarship, there's at least 3 representations of people in that night. One is the first publications that were more towards the right in Paris, that these were threatening masses that were coming to the center of the city, bodies that were out of place in a way. On the left, it was more the suffering subject, and usually photographs of individuals. And I think Kagan's photographs, he always took photographs of individuals, and the idea of how the weight, the violent weight of the French Republic on persons and bodies. And then I think within Algeria, there's more representations of the collectives. Photographs in a more positive light of this revolutionary potential that you've been talking about, and the possible future, the post-colonial future that's embedded in those representations of collectives, basically facing the French state. So, and that I think is the more heroic kind of positioning.
I think at this point, I saw a couple more hands, but I think that as we're at 2 p.m., why don't you continue the conversation right outside? Please join me in thanking our speakers, and please, before you Finally, copies of the book are available for purchase right outside. Congratulations, Bob, on its publications, and thanks for the free.